Welcome to this episode of the President's Diary podcast. This is our very first episode of the year 2026, and I consider this a special episode because we want to go beyond the headlines to examine what the year holds for Africa and its future. The world is rapidly changing, geopolitical rivalries are intensifying, artificial intelligence is reshaping economies, debt, climate shocks, and conflicts are testing governments. And in the middle of this, Africa is no longer at the sidelines, but is becoming central to a new global order. In this conversation, we will explore where Africa is headed in 2026, politically, economically, and strategically. We will ask whether the continent is moving towards stability or fragmentation, towards opportunity or crisis, towards influence or marginalization. We will look at governance, we will look at the economy, youth technology, trade, security, and Africa's place in the world that is rapidly becoming more multipolar and more unpredictable. To help me unpack this, I am joined by Francois Conradi from South Africa. Francois is a political economist with over a decade of experience doing country risk in Africa and brings deep insight into Africa's political and economic trajectory. This is Africa Outlook 2026. My name is Destiny Avu. Let's begin. Francois, welcome to the episode today.
Destiny, thanks for having me.
Yeah, let's dive straight into the topic of today for time's sake. Let's start by having a bigger picture of Africa in 2026. The continent, as we know, is moving through a period of extraordinary change, geopolitically, economically, and demographically. 2026 could mark a turning point or a tipping point for Africa. What do you think Africa will look like politically or economically, and what are the biggest shifts that will take place in Africa in 2026? And according to you, who do you think are the countries that are likely to emerge as Africa's biggest success stories, or the ones that are likely to be at risk?
Okay, that's quite a few different questions. So I think right at the top, I think let's talk about the themes and the dynamics that are going to shape the political environment and the economic environment, and then from there, I think we can move a little into how that's going to affect different countries. So from the on the international political stage, the big dichotomy, let's call it the dialectic, is between multilateralism and unilateralism. So that's the sort of thing that you see play out in, for example, the US pulling out of the G20 summit that was held in Johannesburg, riding roughshod over anything that looks like the UN or international law or anything like that. This tends to fragment any multilateral forum, any even regional economic community, and so on. And the US is quite deliberate in doing this. So since Trump has been in office, for example, he'll invite one or two African presidents from ECOWAS, but not no one from ECOWAS, and stuff like that. So that's something that here and there countries will like and play to. So that's something that's going to tend to, I think, weaken multilateral fora, especially because on the other side of it, you have both in Africa and further abroad, you have people who are welcoming of this trend and want to keep it going. And the focus of that, the most interesting part of the continent for that dynamic is the Sahel, where we've got Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger at odds with ECOWAS, which they have left, and quite a lot of that sort of stance of anti-ECOWAS, more broadly anti-France and anti the West, is popular further afield in Africa and has traction in other countries. So this is something that we must keep an eye on and will play a role in politics in the rest of West Africa. So multilateralism and unilateralism on the one thing. This is also going to play a role in the Horn of Africa, where this is now quite fresh. We still need to see where it's going. But Israel recognizing Somaliland is something very new and different. And it looks like less visibly, but they're still also there are the Emirates and Ethiopia are sort of on the, maybe not saying it, but they watching what's going to happen. And this is a new thing because something like that, the secession of a part of a country, is something that the AU has always stood against. It goes against this principle of we must respect the colonial borders. So that's also something where the institutional in it, what's the word? Institutional uh, strength of something like the AU is going to come up against more localized energies that have support from outside of Africa. So that's something to watch. Economically, um, well, we always got to think about commodities. So economically, it's relevant that the oil price is going down. Although this is now in the short term, this looks uncertain, but in the longer term, we see the oil price going down because global trade isn't looking that healthy. Oil price going down at the same time as base metals and gold are very high, and softs are down. So what this means for African current accounts, especially, and government accounts, is what you've got to think about. So last week, for example, we saw the heads of state of the Economic Community of Central African States, the CEMAC, meet in Brazzaville. They're very worried because their economies run on oil and to a lesser degree oil, cotton, manganese, all commodities where the prices have come off. So now they're facing a bit of a reserve squeeze, and there's talk about the possible devaluation of the CFA franc. Uh, and then something I know we're going to talk about more later is debt. Countries that are coming up against borrowing ceilings and having to talk about restructuring. This is now in the case of Senegal, especially salient. Are they going to do it or not, and what's it going to look like? This is the biggest question for the Senegalese economy. All revolves around how they're going to treat their debt problem. Um, but some other economic indicators are more positive, and those include international energy prices. So the falling oil price, obviously bad for oil producers, but it also means that refined fuel imports are less expensive. And all the countries in Africa that do rely on imported fuels are going to see inflation come down. So good for the consumer. And this is going to allow central banks to keep bringing down interest rates, which have been high of late. So that's also good for the consumer that we're going to see in most countries, a trend towards lower interest rates. I think those are the main top level dynamics that we should be thinking about.
Okay. Like, do you have an example of African countries that are likely to emerge as Africa's biggest success stories in
Uh,
2026?
so economically, from the simple GDP perspective, on our forecasts, the big winners are Rwanda. That's the country that we see showing the fastest growth in 2026 with 7% growth. A lot of that is coming off a low base. The GDP per capita in Rwanda is still quite low, but it's also a very concerted effort by the government to do everything possible to make the business environment easy to navigate, and for investment to happen smoothly. Uganda, uh, we're bullish on Uganda mainly because we still think the Lake Albert oil is going to come online there this year. So that's going to give a boost to development. And Tanzania is mostly a population growth story, but there are things happening there that are improving the business environment, especially in logistics with harbor development and also related to the Lake Albert project in Uganda, an oil pipeline there. So a lot of infrastructure-driven activity in Tanzania. So East Africa is looking positive. The losers are Lesotho, which is the country in Africa that's hit the hardest by Donald Trump's tariff calls. Lesotho's export sector was very dependent on textile exports to the US, so that's being battered. And in South Africa, a little better than last year, but not much. So we see growth at 1.4%. The usual problems in South Africa. So we sort of on the other side of our electricity supply problems, but still have some logistics problems. And then just a generally morose environment from the consumer point of view. Consumer confidence is quite low, and activity general just isn't in the doldrums a bit.
Now let's look at governance and the power structures in Africa. Governance has always been an issue in Africa. 2025 was marked by a lot of elections, one in my country, Cameroon, which was marked by violence. And we had two coups in Africa, I think in Madagascar and in Guinea-Bissau. And 2026 is another year which we're going to have a lot of elections. Uganda just passed. I want us to look at this governance issue, the elections that will follow. What political trends should we expect? And are we expecting more stability or more unrest? And we will see, are we going to see a situation where we have more democratic consolidation or more coups and constitutional crises in 2026?
From this point of view, I think we're going to tend to see more or less consolidation, more deterioration, and maybe some coups. I mean, these are impossible to predict, but I think in general the fact that there is this move away from multilateralism and that authoritarians are more confident in defying norms and so on, just is it creates an environment where there is a bigger risk of something happening outside of a constitutional framework. So again, coming back to the Sahel states, they quite loudly say that we don't need elections. We are That doesn't mean sovereignty and so on. Our peoples are happy for us to be here. But every now and again, in January again, there was this rumor of a coup attempt in Burkina Faso involving Damiba, who was then extradited out of Togo. And that is what always happens when if there's no democratic way for people in those countries to compete for power, then they're going to go outside a constitutional framework. So coup risk is elevated in a country that's run by a military government. Then there's the fact that these governments have uh, people in other countries who think they're going the right way. So this is especially salient for Benin, where there's a election in April, and Patrice Talon isn't running again, but he made it impossible for his main competition to put someone forward. So Benin is one where I think the risk is quite high. Guinea-Bissau, you just mentioned, so they're having a rerun of that election this coming December this year. So again, so nothing's been fixed that led to the coup. So maybe that'll happen again. Um, and then not election related, but Tunisia is also a place where I sort of get the sense that a coup is becoming more likely all the time, where people are just really fed up with the president, and it's sort of looking like the kind of place where it might happen. The good news is that this isn't everywhere. So there's an election in Zambia in August where I you could see HH Hakainde Hichilema step away from, be defeated and step away from office. So that's good. But one to watch. So the government has taken some steps to intimidate journalists and civil society that we hadn't expected when he came in, that have been a bit discouraging. But there are places where you see this kind of sort of democratic opening up, and that's good. And also, there are two countries where old, long-serving presidents are going to win another term in office. That's Djibouti and Congo Republic. So that's obviously, as we saw in Cameroon, that's just sort of that's you wish that doesn't happen. Cameroon and Uganda, you wish to see the end of that. You wish to see these old guys, make room for something fresh, but it doesn't happen in too many places.
Uh, you talked about the debt problem in Senegal, and I want us to take a look generally at Africa's economic situation in the year 2026. Um, do you see 2026 as a year of economic recovery, or maybe say deeper debt crisis for Africa? And which sectors in Africa do you think will drive Africa's growth in 2026? Manufacturing, agriculture, tech, minerals, or whatever?
No, so the good news stories are going to relate to the lower inflation environment, low interest rate environment. So the good news is in most places, I'm going to generalize now, but in most places, the good news is going to come from a relief on consumer demand, and then going to be in the tertiary sector in services. You're going to see households having a little more cash to spend, and then spending that in the consumer economy. So from the overall economic point of view, that's where the good news stories are going to come from. So mostly, I think in services. Here and there might be some good news stories on exports to China of hard commodities, and obviously gold is we see what the gold price is doing. So gold is going to keep buoying a lot of economic activity. But apart from that, global trade isn't looking great. So a lot of countries, especially in North Africa and also South Africa, that are betting on exports to Europe and the US, that those sectors aren't going to do particularly well. So it's mostly consumer-facing services sectors that I would bet on.
Now, let's come to the issue of technology and artificial intelligence, as we say. It's a subject we cannot ignore. We had the meetings in Davos for the World Economic Forum, and about 50% of the conversations were covered by artificial intelligence, the subject of artificial intelligence. I want us to look at Africa's engagement in artificial intelligence and technology. How do you think artificial intelligence and automation may change Africa's economy in 2026, and which African countries are best positioned to benefit from a digital economy?
Yes. The AI solutions and the way they're going to change African economies, this is something to watch, and you're going to see some really exciting things in all sectors. I mean, so from agriculture, there's some really cool things happening in AI for agriculture that people are talking about that are going to improve productivity in agriculture and increase Africans' ability to make money from their land. So that's all great. These things, I mean, I'm not close enough to have seen any such projects that have already made a big difference to economies, but it is definitely going to happen in the shape of higher productivity, higher output per head. So you can say that economies overall across the value chain are going to benefit from higher productivity. But something also to keep in mind about AI is it costs, you got to pay for it, and you got to pay a foreign company for it, like typically a US company, but maybe increasingly it's going to be Chinese or European companies. And this is an import on the services account. So that's something that's going to show up in all countries' current accounts, in the same way as we already see outflows related to software licenses or web hosting services. That specific category of services imports is going to keep swelling. So that's something that will, and a services import, I mean, that's negative for GDP. So that is going to constrain our economies, is all this money that's going to flow outside of Africa to pay for AI services.
Let's look at security and the conflict outlook for 2026. Africa is host to about 50% of the world's armed conflict right now. 2025 was a year marked by a lot of conflicts in the DRC. We have Sudan, which is still ongoing, and we have a lot of mediation efforts which were pushed by President Trump. But the year 2026, I don't know if we have promises for peace or promises for more conflict. So I just want to find out from you, which regions of Africa do you think are likely to experience instability in 2026? And let's look at the subject of terrorism and insurgency. Do you see it expanding or shrinking? And how would the wars in, let me say, Sudan, the Sahel, and Africa, and the Horn of Africa shape the general outlook of Africa in 2026?
Yeah, it's a good idea to treat institutional conflict separately from terrorism. So probably the worst area is Sudan and the Horn. Sudan itself, there's no let up. So you can see the RSF rebels, they're trying to establish control over a piece of territory in the south and west. So there's horrendous fighting between them and the army for specific villages in Kordofan and Darfur. That doesn't let up. South Sudan seems about to kick off again in a big way. So the UN is issuing warnings that the army and the what they call SPLM in opposition are about to fight again. So there's a SPLM IO commander has called for his people to move into Juba, and this might also now overlap with what's happening in the Horn. With what are the Somalis going to do about this Somaliland thing? Are the Emiratis going to back the Somalilanders? Then the Emiratis have been helping the RSF, so maybe those RSF Sudanese are going to get involved in the Horn. Ethiopia's got interest there. Egypt's got interest there. There's a lot happening in around Somaliland, and also Djibouti is also a base for the US and France and China. So there's a lot happening right there. The conflict in the DRC somehow has been looking up for a week or so, where the M23 has pulled out of Uvira and saying they're doing this in accordance with their commitments. So that's almost surprisingly positive. But the overall conflict dynamic in the Eastern DRC involving the Rwandans and the Congolese and all these local militias that have interests on one side or the other is has been a problem for 20 years, and it's going to stay with 30 years. So those are when you talk about conflict, those are the main areas. And then there's also downside risks of a more formal conflict, with planes and tanks and so on in Libya, where you've got these two centers of power. And then small chance, but something to think about is what's the chance of a confrontation between Morocco and Algeria over Western Sahara? So these are two really big conventional armies with well-equipped air forces. So those are the areas where it's looking negative. And then terrorism, the big problem is in the Sahel, where you have two different, so there's a Al Qaeda linked and a Islamic State linked insurgencies in the Sahel that are fighting against the armies of Mali and Burkina Faso and Niger. So what's also happening is that the land degradation in the Sahel has made it almost impossible to make a living the way people were making a living 50 years ago. So they need to find something else to do. And then there's this jihadist network that provides steady employment and some prestige. So that is attractive to a lot of young men. Names in the middle belt of Nigeria. So that's going to keep happening as well. And similar with, again, different people in northeastern Nigeria, in Borno. So that whole Sahel and top half of Nigeria, I'm afraid, well, there's no prospect of it improving, and it's going to remain a problem.
Okay. Let's look at Africa's role in the global power game. We have a situation in the world right now where the global order is changing. Experts are now, and they say that the rules-based order is breaking down. Whether to an advantage or disadvantage, we don't know. But Africa is right in the middle of it as great power struggles between the East and the West is playing out. So how will these shifting alliances affect Africa in 2026? And how can Africa position itself as a global player in this age of great power competition? And lastly, what strategic choices do you think African leaders should take in 2026 that will usher a breakthrough for Africa, economically, politically, and to enhance our role in on the global stage?
Yeah, so I think the best bet for Africa would be to lean very hard into multilateralism. If something like ECOWAS or SADC or the East African Community is showing strain, then the absolute top priority should be to fix that strain and to do what you can to improve cohesion and unity in these blocks, and then ultimately in Africa, because any division is going to be exploited by different powers working for their own ends, even within countries where increasingly politics it's going to happen more and more that you're going to sort of see clearly that there's a pro-Russia party and a pro-Western party in domestic politics in Africa. And that's something we really need to be careful of, because that's what we had in the 70s and 80s, and you don't want that way. So the priority should be cohesion and multilateralism and making forums like ECOWAS and the EAC work. I think that's something and it also ties into the economy. So if we can work harder to make stuff like the African Free Trade Continental Free Trade Agreement work, and improve customs processes and just make it easier for our people to trade across borders, that'll be a big one, and everyone will benefit.
Oh, thank you so much. Fortunately, we have to end for today because of time constraint. Francois, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for taking out time this evening to talk to me. And I believe the question is no longer whether Africa matters. The question is whether Africa will shape its own destiny or have it shaped for it. Thank you for joining us on this Africa Outlook 2026. Until next time, and hope we stay informed, stay engaged, and keep thinking Africa forward. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful rest of the evening.